Thank you everyone for coming to this final stage of this Ph.D. program. Now, how do I begin? I think the starting of this project has taken me through many directions and turns, and here I am now to present my work that I've spent writing and thinking about for the last 4 to 5 years. And I think before I begin, I should say that I'm thankful to the friends and all professors at the department, and thank you for all that you've done. Well, to begin with, the title of my thesis is Not at Home in the Nation, Naga Identity and Everyday Life in Contemporary City. And I wanted to give a summation of what I looked at in my thesis for the benefit of everyone present here, as well as lay the foundations for the context from which I will try my best to answer the questions posed within the thesis and here in the context of this Viva. In summation, my thesis looks at the dynamic between the nation and the state of Nagaland, particularly the prism of the everyday lives of the average contemporary Naga individual living his or her life in the city of Hyderabad as well as in Nagaland itself, and looking through the challenge to the notion of the nation-state from the periphery. In the nation's mode of self-preservation, there is a pronounced investedness in citizenship, demarcated by lines drawn on the cartographic representation of the nation. However, my thesis tries to understand how such an exercise of integration fails to notice that there are localities at work in a constant redefinition of identities, especially in a plural setup like the city. In these localities, I have found in my research, and standing from an equally estranged location in the city of Hyderabad, away from my homeland, there are groups that have come together to continually articulate what defines a Naga and her aspirations in the new millennium. In order to do this, I turn to the study of the everyday life to identify groups that negotiate local spaces and the processes of identity in the experience of the everyday. For the purpose and for the sake of organization, for this purpose and for the sake of organization, I have divided my study into certain sections which are as follows. Number one, I tried to establish a discursive construction for the idea of the Northeast, locating the term within popular usage. In this section, I began with a mapping of the terrain of contemporary discourses around the politics of the Northeast, for which I surveyed certain texts which led to an understanding of a sub-nationalist or federalist democracy that subsists as a sub-narrative within the dominant discourse of the nation. And in this, I identified what I termed as the possibility of the limits of democracy in Nagaland, looking particularly at the present ceasefire talks between the Naga nationalist groups and the Indian government. In the process, my study veered towards civil society initiatives in Naga politics. For this purpose, I found it conducive for my research to turn to the politics of what I termed durable disorder in the Naga context. Further, I have conducted interviews with leaders and key persons active in the Naga national movement and within civil society groups, which I compiled in an appendix section. In my chapter 3 particularly, I focus on the city, the everyday life, because it is an important and intimate space of experience for the Nagas in Hyderabad, the socio-religious institution called the Naga Christian Fellowship. In this chapter, I present the dynamic between the politics of separation and the politics of reparation that has emerged from years of insurgent voices that have existed among the Nagas. Having laid down in my chapters 1 and 2 the state of contemporary politics in Nagaland, I moved to analyze the evolution of these voices of dissent and the way the demands for sovereignty has changed over time. In order to carry out this study, I turned to Arjuna theses on localities and of identities in the city as spaces of citizenship, articulations, and translocal citizenship. The idea of sovereignty that is so closely connected with the notion of homeland and the territory for the Nagas is reconsidered in my thesis from the location of Naga Voices in Hyderabad, which has seen in recent times an emerging Naga youth in higher educational institutions as well as in the professional sectors. The reason for the focus on Hyderabad in my thesis is because the Naga community in the city has markedly chosen to remain autonomous from the more dominant socio-political organizations of home, such as the Naga Students Union, which can be considered the umbrella organization of Naga students based in location outside of Nagaland. Another compelling reason for this field of study is that Hyderabad is also one of the metro cities in India to have an all Naga tribes fellowship through the community of Naga Christian Fellowship. Unlike other metro cities where different inter-tribe fellowship function under the NCF as well. Such differences made it important to read the Naga youth, specifically in the context of the cosmopolis and what such a situation does to the notion of Naga nationalism and dreams of sovereignty at the present moment. My project attempted to map out the practices through which individual choices are recast and how the individual members of the Naga groups in Hyderabad constantly reiterate their stand as modern individuals in the cosmopolis. Perhaps it is at this juncture, it is important to explain what I mean by the term everyday. In order to work through these multiple discourses around the Northeast and Naga politics, the path my thesis takes on the idea of the everyday becomes significant, even though the counter-argument would be that the everyday is obvious. However, despite being an evasive concept, to quote Frank Martin, the interpretation of everyday culture is often a counterintuitive, even unsettling endeavor, yet also a very rewarding project, one that can lead to unexpected and illuminating insight into the surprisingly complex significance of all the things we do day after day while barely noticing that we're doing them. The everyday in my thesis is thus subjected to a kind of scrutiny that transmutes it as being far from banal, and we observe that everyday life is rather organized. And to quote Martin again, the material and ideological dominance of particular groups and driven by the competing desires and demands of the subordinated. The infinitesimal of the everyday are systematized by a completely historical and political domination and subordination, as well as mired in power and resistance. What has been vital for my study has been to accept that the everyday lives of all of us has been shaped by this difficulty, that institutional constraints are always answered by individual acts of resistance, and individual agency is everywhere conditioned by structural constraints. I recognize some of these difficulties in the narrative text that my thesis used as examples of the everyday, for which I turned to literary representations of Naga lives in the city as well as back home in Nagaland. In this section, I looked closely at storytelling and narration as modes of evasion in the everyday life of the Nagas. However, please bear in mind that this use of the term evasion is not to signify an escape. Rather, it becomes a key term in my thesis to encapsulate the kind of negotiation that everyday realities faced by the Nagas, constituting what is familiar as well as strange, bearing in mind that a critical analysis is possible to be undertaken here. For this purpose, I took up the themes of being as contingent to the notion of home, wandering, voyaging, communing, and storytelling. This I did through a study of literary representations from the Northeast. A key text was Tulsila Au's collection of stories titled "These Hills Called Home, Stories from a War Zone," which in my mind represent a prismatic perspective on what it means for a Naga to have a home, which I show as a disturbed or unstable notion. In her stories, I try to connect a narration of everyday life, which is looked at in close proximity, melding multiple narratives on coloniality, the imperialism of the nation state, and a local sensibility. In order to maintain a semblance of the balance, I also referred to Siddhartha Deb's Surface, whose narration works as both objective reflections as well as the unease in grappling a straightforward notion of Naga politics. I found his narration, which, although structured as a travelogue across a violent terrain, recalling everyday conversations and meetings with people in ordinary circumstances, which again reinforced my focus on the everyday across Nagaland and the Northeast. The perspectives that emerge within such narratives present an opportunity, which my thesis expresses, to understand the grappling with the sense of stability that is hard to come by in the context of even the everyday Northeast experience, but which nevertheless constitutes an important facet of the political landscape of this region. Therefore, to a certain extent, the methodology pursued in this study is informed by my identity as a Naga living in Hyderabad for more than a decade now, and by my participation in existing Naga groups in the city, an experience which itself has evolved over time, prompting a subjective reading of the situation. The city of Hyderabad, my host and home away from home, is the site of inquiry that I established in my thesis as a way to read the everyday life of the Nagas in the city. To this end, I briefly turn to Jacques Derrida and his reading of hospitality, which asserts that one is first required to be the host or the master with the power to host the guest. And Derrida points out that the display of this power is performed in the conditions of self-identity as a host and the marking of a territory. Second, this guest, even when well received, is primarily a foreigner and must remain one. Therefore, the hospitality that is due to this guest is conditional to the controlled parameters within the hospitality. This paradoxical ambivalence, Derrida adds, is further marked out by precisely underlining a threshold within which the guest has to be hosted. Beyond that threshold lies the notion of hostility in order to sustain the sovereignty of the host. It is this uneasy dynamic that spurs certain questions as well as observations in my thesis. For example, how does this understanding of hospitality offered by Derrida shape the understanding of a people's or a community's idea of being at home, the idea of homeland, and what a nation is? Also, what is it that makes a people in compatibility with the general interest of the nation? In the Naga context, if there are aberrations of societies or communities, such as the underground groups and their influence, that can lay a claim on the particular, how would the state deal with its hospitality? Have these people crossed over the threshold of hospitality onto hostility? And being the host, the state reaffirms its legitimacy, endorsing its role of the host acting within its legalities. However, are these legalities unquestionable or sacrosanct? One may ask, given the focus of the extra-constitutionality of mechanisms such as EFLuniversity. These are some preliminary questions that are highlighted in my work. This uneasy state of affairs for me corresponds closely to the idea of durable disorder put forward by Sanjit Barua. In very simple terms, durable disorder, as suggested by Sanjit Barua, is the result of a symbiotic relationship between state and society in a uniquely syncretic and covert continuity in the modes of local movements. Barua contextualizes this disorder as observed in the Northeast region, wherein secessionists such as the Naga insurgents, as well as those who acceded to the state, can be seen as part of the actually evolving existing governmental structure of the region, be it from a formal setting or informal setup. My thesis contends that if we consider the political history of the Northeast, this is a region where India can recall success stories of counterinsurgency operations that fill the text of security and territorial defense studies. Here is a region that has seen institutionalized violence as well as rampant insurgent violence with a thriving gun culture woven into the texture of the everyday life of the people. Simultaneously, there is an awkward coexistence of state repression, elected representations of governments, a seemingly systematic and accepted parallel underground government, a vocally upright public sphere and civil society, as well as a thriving investment in the name of development. In brief, one can say that there are workings of formal and informal structures of governance within the democratic setup, while the social-cultural politics of this region is strictly dominated by the issues of the sheer number of insurgent groups representing the multi-ethnic people of this region, reflecting quite clearly the durability of disorder that Sanjit Barua's concept strives to portray. The conflicts of this region, especially the Naga context that my thesis focuses on, carry dissonances that spell out many axioms from assertion of ethnic homeland to self-styled sovereignty, from indigenous claims bordering on self-interest to intolerance towards outsiders. Sanjit Barua also suggests that given the appendages to ethnicity and the propagation of violence through this continuity, to a large extent, this violence is the result of a symbiotic relationship between state and society. While the contemporary politics of the region has arrived at a stage where the question of ending insurgency emerges strongly, an understanding of the politics of this region has always been one impaired by state methods of governance and reading insurgency in the region as a law and order problem. Deviating from this norm of studying Northeast politics, my thesis emulates Barua's attempt to bring aspects of the ethnic militias, counterinsurgency operations, state-backed militias, developmentalist practices, and the deformed institutions of democratic governance together and suggest for a coherent understanding of the whole as a durable disorder. To this, I add that this symbiosis is far from a complete picture or the final solution to the problem at hand. I contend in my thesis an acknowledgement of the complexity of the politics of the region. To expand on the notion of disorder, I include within its purview the notion of the outsider Naga living prominently not in the region but outside of it, and therefore reshaping the symbiotic nexus that exists between the nation and the sub-nation. For the Nagas, politics is often ascribed to state functions based on anthropological truths. In the case of the Nagas, the colonial legacy of the Christian missionaries is seen in the making of the modern Naga through Christianity, the armed struggle, and the emergence of an effective civil society, which is attributed to the shaping of contemporary Naga society. More than anything else, this kind of politics has become the base of operation for the contemporary reality of a Naga. It is on this particular ground that a Naga's contemporary sense of politics is formed, although, as my thesis argues, there is a vital opposing pole in this playing field, such that there is a constant engagement with making sense of the experience of now or the present, taking into account the legacy of the past to find an answer to what do the Nagas want. This experience has been realized in the form of an armed struggle against the authoritative Indian state for the Naga homeland. Yet again, this struggle is often marred by internal divisions. While the Indian response to this experience has been to further complicate it by making it a law and order problem, by defining the internal divisions as age-old internecine feuds among the tribes. In reality, however, the contemporary Naga experience is much more complex and still an unfinished journey. It's locating itself within the political complexities of the present. In the search for the final closure, there may be many loopholes in this uncharted land of what my thesis contends as a becoming, and the experience might have to be reenacted numerous times without end. This becoming of the Naga being in the contemporary is therefore, I argue, a crucial facet of the politics of Nagaland. On the whole, my thesis hopes to add to the contemporary understanding of Naga society and, more importantly, to emerge as a critical study on existing discourses of nation-state in Naga politics. The minute yet distinctive ephemeral ploys that Naga people establish to oppose domination and achieve some scope of personal agency stands vital to an operative sense of self-identity. These small intersections of anomalies and questionings enable us to negotiate larger structures of power while also helping us to negotiate the real and the immediate, the daily routine and the frequent bristlings of the politics of everyday life. That more or less sums up the entirety of my thesis and one of the arguments that I presented in my work. However, I realized that I have not changed the